There's something fairly significant happening in the paranormal world, and I haven't heard anyone talk about it. The most haunted nightclub in the world is being demolished. That's right, Bobby Mackey's demonic music hall is scheduled to be torn down by the end of this summer. If you aren't familiar with Bobby Mackey's, I'll give you a quick rundown. Bobby Mackey's is a building that's been around for over 100 years in Wilder, Kentucky, but it wasn't always a nightclub. Originally, it was a slaughterhouse, but the gore doesn't end there. Not by a long shot. From the first time Bobby and his pregnant wife, Janet, walked through the bar, they began having bizarre, unexplainable experiences. Janet seemed to be the target for this paranormal activity. One day, she heard a woman's voice coming up from a drain in one of the sinks, and as she stopped to listen, she watched blood begin to bubble up through the drain. As she tried to yell for help, something grabbed her head and pushed her towards it, trying to force her into the thick, dark liquid that was quickly filling the sink. It was only when the handyman Carl Lawson arrived to help her that she was able to break away from the spirit's grasp. But sadly, the attacks on Janet only got worse. One day, she was pushed down the stairs by an invisible force. This caused her to go into labor, and she gave birth at only 5 months pregnant to a baby girl that only weighed 1 pound and 5 ounces. Luckily, her daughter survived the premature birth, but before being rushed to the hospital, Janet told Carl about what had happened, and she let him know that from the floor where she landed, she saw a man glaring down at her from the top of the stairs where she was pushed. Bobby Mackey was highly skeptical, and when Carl and Janet talked to him about their experiences, he'd brush them off and tell them to keep quiet because ghosts were bad for business, and he desperately wanted his country music hall to be successful so he could provide for his family.
Are you buying this? Are you buying this?
No. First of all, I don't believe in ghosts at all.
It gets even stranger, though. One day, Carl found a journal in the floorboards that belonged to a woman who wrote about her tragic fate. Back in the 1950s, there was a young woman named Johanna who was the daughter of the nightclub owner. She had taken her own life after discovering that her own father had killed the man she loved. She was 5 months pregnant at the time of her untimely departure. But the tragedy goes back even further. In 1896, the headless body of 22-year-old Pearl Bryan was found in a field. Pearl had died at the hands of her boyfriend, Scott Jackson, and his friend, Alonzo Walling. Her head had been removed to prevent law enforcement from identifying the body, and it was never found. However, even without her head, they were able to determine that the body was Pearl's. Jackson and Walling had murdered Pearl during a botched abortion attempt, and she was also 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. Her head was never found, but people speculate that it was dumped in the well at the bottom of the slaughterhouse. Jackson and Walling were hanged for their unforgivable crimes. The well was built for the slaughterhouse as a way to dispose of the byproducts of meat processing. It was dubbed the portal to hell by the handyman Carl, who had moved into an apartment at Bobby Mackey's. He went down to the basement one night when a storm had caused the power to go out. As he searched for the breaker box, he noticed a door on the floor, and when he lifted it, he found a deep, black chasm. He suddenly realized he was no longer alone, and as he turned around, 2 men stood glaring at him. He ran back up the stairs, terrified by what he'd experienced. He swore that on that day, something evil had escaped from that old well. There are so many layers to the haunting of Bobby Mackey's, and I'm barely scratching the surface. It's always a little disappointing to hear of historic and creepy places being demolished, but from what I've gathered, they intend to keep the portal to hell and rebuild a new nightclub where the old one stood. But you might ask, what will happen to all the misplaced souls that inhabit the music hall? Well, I fear we'll soon find out.